Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Delano D'Souza. My guest today is Yuval Noah Harari, historian, philosopher, and author. His best-selling book, Sapiens, has come out in graphic form this month, and the first series is titled The Birth of Humankind. We can now go across to Tel Aviv and speak to Yuval Harari. Yuval, thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. A graphic version of Sapiens will make the work more accessible. What are you hoping a younger audience will take away from the book?
To really understand the big picture about who we are and where we came from, you can't really understand anything about the world today without this kind of long-term perspective. We are in the midst of this epidemic, for example, but it's important to realize that epidemics only started with the agricultural revolution. Hunter-gatherers who lived before the agricultural revolution did not suffer from epidemics at all. So to understand the relations between us and the other members of the ecological system, you need to really go back in time. And this is what we try to do in this graphic novel.
Indeed, this book is coming out during a global pandemic. Back in March, you had written in the Financial Times that the economic shock and the epidemic itself could be solved by global cooperation. 7 months since you wrote that opinion piece, how do you think we fared?
We could have done better. We could also have done worse, of course, but we don't see the kind of global cooperation that would have made it possible to solve this crisis much more easily. There is not enough cooperation on the medical and scientific front. You're seeing actually the beginning of a kind of vaccine war or a vaccine arms race instead of a global, united attempt to share information. And also in the economic front, there is no, even after so many months, there is no global economic plan for how humankind will deal with this. I guess some countries, the rich countries, they will be okay, but many countries might completely collapse economically because of this crisis. And there seems to be no adults in the room, no global political leadership of how to address it.
You know, the head of the World Health Organization said the pandemic has been prolonged because, as you said, there's no global leadership. The European Union has tried to take the lead after the United States withdrew from the World Health Organization, but they haven't been bullish enough, have they?
The European Union is one, I think, of the better places, better areas in the world in terms of how it dealt with the crisis. After a problematic start, the continuation was much better. But again, we need to think about it globally and not regionally. And Europe is still not willing and maybe not powerful enough to replace the United States as world leader. And we really have seen the abdication of the United States from its traditional leadership role in the world. You know, even within the US itself, the current administration has abdicated its responsibility, basically pushing the responsibility to the level of states and municipalities. The president and the federal government telling the local authorities, you do something about it. We are not going to do anything.
Can the US regain its position with a Biden presidency, perhaps?
Could be. I don't know. I'm not a prophet. It depends on whichever administration comes to power, what they will do. But, you know, the world cannot go on relying on the US and waiting every 4 years to see who the Americans elect this time. This should be a kind of wake-up call for the global community that we need a more robust system of global cooperation and global leadership, which does not depend on any single country.
You know, you also wrote back in March in that Financial Times piece that an informed population is more powerful than a policed population. Yet, across Europe, nighttime curfews are now being implemented to limit the spread of COVID-19. Where are we headed with all of this?
I don't think that there is a contradiction between having a democratic system with an informed population and taking some drastic measures when they are needed, but they should be based on trust trust that goes both ways, between the government and the population, and also between the population and the government. Even to enforce something like a curfew, it's much, much easier when people understand why it is needed and when they cooperate with it willingly, than when you have to put a policeman to follow everybody around. And of course, in terms of the long-term consequences, we need to overcome this pandemic, but it's also vital to keep human freedom and to keep the democratic systems going. We don't want to sacrifice them just for the sake of overcoming this epidemic, especially as there are actually far worse crises waiting for us in the future. You know, COVID-19, for all the problems it causes, it's a relatively small problem. The mortality rate from COVID-19 is less than 1%. Compared to other big epidemics in history, it's very small. This is not the Black Death. This is not the influenza of 1918. Compared to other global problems, like the ecological crisis and like the rise of disruptive technologies, such as AI, this is a relatively easy crisis. If we cannot deal with this crisis through cooperation, then what chance do we have to deal with these future crises?
I want to talk about the issue of trust, which you mentioned, because trust, I feel, has been eroded since March. Let me give you an example of Paris, for instance. When we went back in March, before the lockdowns were enforced, masks, we were told not to use the mask. Then after we exited the lockdown, masks were being encouraged, but only indoors. Then after this, during the summer, 130 streets in Paris, you were required to wear masks. So depending on where you turned, literally. Now, of course, you have to wear masks wherever you go. But trust, this has really worn thin after all these months in public officials.
Well, I'm not familiar with the situation in France specifically, so I can't comment on that. But, you know, the fact that the instructions and the policy changes is not necessarily a bad thing. We are learning. Science never claims to have all the answers from, especially not from day zero. We gather evidence, we analyze it, we try something, it doesn't work, we try something else. This is how science progresses. I think the key thing is to keep our trust in the scientific authorities. Unfortunately, over the last few years, we have seen a deliberate attempt in many places around the world to undermine trust in science, undermine trust in the academy. These attempts were made by all kinds of politicians who wanted to gain some political advantage out of it, but now we are paying the price for it. And we see the spread, not only of distrust, but the deliberate spread of all kinds of ridiculous conspiracy theories. Now, unfortunately, there is a kind of imbalance between the scientific truth and these conspiracy theories. The truth is usually complicated and often painful, unpleasant.
Indeed.
Whereas when you invent some fictional story, you can make it very simple and you can make it very flattering.
You know,
but we have to keep our trust, our faith. Yeah.
You know, I want to move on now, because within weeks, India is on course to become the world's worst affected country, yet the government is unlikely to impose restrictive measures to limit the spread of COVID-19 because the economic shock of the lockdown has been so devastating. Has the economic costs of lockdowns been so hard that some countries will just let this virus spread?
I'm not sure. That's not my field of expertise. I'm neither an epidemiologist nor an economist. But yeah, it's obvious that we can't look at this epidemic just through a medical perspective or just through the perspective of COVID-19. It has a lot of other effects. And again, this goes back to the question of global cooperation. The richest countries in the world, they will be okay. They will somehow muddle through. But the real problem is that there are many countries in the world that they don't have either the medical infrastructure or the deep pockets to sustain themselves through this prolonged crisis, unless we have an economic safety net, a global safety net, we might see entire economies, entire countries collapsing, and the resulting chaos and violence and waves of immigration will destabilize the entire world. So again, I really hope that we will see a collaborative global effort, not just to develop medical treatments and to distribute essential medical equipment, but also to have an economic global plan. How do we make sure that no part of the human species is left behind in this crisis?
Indeed, because we do have some figures that are, some predictions saying that at least 85 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty this year. Finally, from me, Yuval, what's next for you and Sapiens? Would Netflix be something you'd consider? Because everyone seems to be going the Netflix route, because I know you prefer TV shows to books.
No, I like both, not just TV shows. I also write and read books. Our main project now is the graphic novel. This is just the first volume of it. And we really, it was the most fun project I worked with the two artists, Danielle and David, who are really, the really geniuses behind this book. And we experimented with many different ways of how to tell history, how to tell science. One part is like a detective story. One part is like a superhero action movie. This was the fun thing about this project, that you can really break all the academic conventions and go wild with different ways of telling and doing science. And I hope to continue with this. And if there is an opportunity to also do something on TV, then why not? But the main thing is really to build a bridge between science and the general population. We see now with COVID the importance of having a good scientific education for everybody, not just people who go to university or whatever. And future crises will also demand this kind of thing.
Yuval, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Yuval Noah Harari joining us there from Tel Aviv. That wraps up this edition of The Interview. Thank you very much for watching.
2 months after the explosion that shook Lebanon to its core, the port of Beirut, the country's economic hub, remains in ruins. Our correspondents have compiled a series of touching stories and heartrending images. From the mutual support of the people directly affected, to the NGOs hard at work on the ground, from the stories of those still missing, to the businesses and students struggling to survive, and the urgent need for medical supplies. 2 months after the explosion in the port of Beirut, the road to recovery is long. Don't miss this series of exclusive reports on France24.com.